Welcome everybody to another PCS Insight webinar session. Joining will be Jan Bell, and I am Harry Nutos. We'll wait another minute or two for everybody to join, and then we will start. So bear with us for a second. Yeah, and shall we share some of the logistics for the session today while we're waiting?
Sure, why not?
Yes, so this session will last about an hour, then we'll have another 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. During that period, the handout of the slides from this session will become available. And once you exit the session, you will be redirected to a very short questionnaire. It's only 5 questions. It should take you less than 30 seconds to answer, and we would really, really appreciate if you do. Ian, shall we start or should we wait another minute? What do you think?
Wait another minute. If people will bear with us, thank you very much. As you know, people join over time. So let's give it another minute and then we will set off.
Okay.
Meantime, welcome for those of you who have already joined us. Hopefully this will be an interesting and slightly different approach to things.
You can post your questions on the chat. It's a private chat, so the audio is not okay. Okay.
Said that the audio is not okay. If other people have problems with the audio, could they please just mention this in the chat, or so that we know whether it's a generalized problem or just a problem with one of our members.
If you could please restart, your audio should work. Perfect. I think, Ian, we should start.
Please do.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's the time of the year where everybody kind of reflects back to see what happened, what were the expectations, whether they materialized, but also the time where everybody tries to make some projection and forecast for the future. And it's fair to say, and we had also a similar discussion between ourselves about this, but we realized that there are, I think, wider forces at play that will, and we'll try to look a bit further than, let's say, the immediate couple of next months or the next year. And while we're doing that, I think we came up with the idea to call this webinar Quo Vadis. And Ian, I mean, a lot of people call me and says, why is that Quo Vadis? What does it mean? Where it came from? And I think we had that discussion between ourselves that people might question that, or at least go back and learn a bit of Latin. So I think I'll let you explain why we call this webinar Quo Vadis and what's the rationale for it. So if you can start, that would be great.
Thanks, Harry. Indeed, Quo Vadis. So those of our listeners who have a classical religious education or enjoy kind of old Hollywood movies will know, of course, that the answer to the question Quo Vadis, which is where are you going, is, of course, to go and get crucified upside down. So hopefully people won't take away from the title that this is where we think the securitization market is going. The reason we wanted to do this is, first of all, because a lot of commentators, research houses are going to come up with a lot of very good papers about the shorter term, what to expect in 2022, whether, Dutch RMBS shows more relative value than Spanish RMBS, and a lot of those very focused questions, which are important to market participants. But they're going to do that, and we wanted to do something different. And the other reason for this is that we've been reading a lot in the press, in the trade press, and in the research houses about how well 2021 had gone compared to the previous year in terms of volumes, etc. And it seemed to me that the community, both policymakers and market participants, might be losing a little bit sight of the longer term. When we started talking about creating a securitization regime, creating an STS category, looking at the calibrations, the idea, openly and very clearly expressed both by the securitization community and by the public policy makers, was that we wanted in Europe, and I take the term in the geographic sense, we wanted in Europe to get to a securitization market that was central to the financial architecture of the continent. We wanted to get a securitization market that allowed securitization to be used by banks to really manage proactively their capital. We wanted a securitization market that looked not entirely dissimilar in its function and its format than the one that you see in the United States, setting aside the agencies. And therefore, we were looking at a securitization market that was for 500 billion, 600 billion. Even the European Commission had, after STS came out, set a target of they would consider this a success if we had an extra 100 billion in securitization. And they were criticized at the time for maybe lowballing their expectations. Of course, now we are seeing a lot of people saying, oh, look, it's a great year for securitization. We're up 15, 20 billion. Most of that is CLOs. Most of that is resets and refis. And therefore, when I was looking at this, there seemed to be this disconnect between the ambitions that we used to have and hopefully still have and what was happening on the ground. And therefore, we wanted to have a more of a 10,000 meter view of the future of securitization. That's about 30,000 feet for those of you still in imperial measurements, rather than focus on very narrow issues of relative pricing, spread compression, etc. So that's why we did this. And what we're trying to do here is look at the very big pictures. If you're thinking in the longer term and about where the securitization market as a whole in Europe is going to go, and with the hope of maybe going towards that more ambitious market, what are you going to be paying attention to? What should you start looking at? Yeah, so that's if you want, where we're going.
Yeah. So Ian, if we take you on that, I mean, what is your view? I mean, what is the number one macro issue that you think is affecting Asians now and could affect Asians going forward?
Okay, so for us, the biggest player in this story, which for us is a story of a market that's still really struggling, that's still not meeting the ambitions that had been set for it, is monetary policy. So let's go quickly through the monetary policy, and you'll see, sadly, everybody knows my views on Brexit. Sadly, we'll have to do this presentation in two parts, in each section, the European Union part and the United Kingdom part. So let's start with the ECB. So one interesting thing here, this is just a slide to remind people of the tools that the ECB have to put liquidity into the system. But there is also a very interesting thing about this slide when I put it together, which is that in that burgundy color, you have the standard tools, those tools that the ECB has always had since it was beginning, MRO, LTRO, 1 week cash into the system, 3-month cash into the system. These are called, in the ECB's own lingo, the standard tools. And then you have the non-standard monetary policy measures that are considered to be the exceptional measures. And one of the things that is interesting here, so you can see them, of course, many of you know them, the asset purchase program, the outright monetary transactions, which was very controversial when it was put in place because it involves the ECB funding sovereign debt, was never used, by the way. It's there because it exists, but it has never been used. The TLTRO, which we're going to talk a lot about, and the pandemic emergency purchase program, which is really just another version of the asset purchase program. But what is interesting about this, and it's a question that I have been asking myself, and I think other people have been asking themselves is that if you have an emergency non-standard monetary tool that starts in 2009, by 2021, is it still an emergency tool? And how long, if ever, do we go back just to the burgundy parts of this slide? So that's an interesting question in and of itself, and which goes beyond securitization. But let's talk about the tools that matter. So here, you've got the asset purchase program. Many people have seen this slide. Two things about this slide that are very noticeable. The first one, of course, is the size of this monstrosity. I don't mean monstrosity in a bad sense, but it is just an enormous thing. It's topped 3.2 trillion euros. The other thing which is interesting about this slide is you see there are 4 programs, one for public sector, one for covered bonds, one for corporates, the yellow part, and then the asset-backed purchase program. And if you're my age, you will really start to struggle to see that very thin piece of green at the top of those bars that represents the asset-backed purchase program. Very, very little of the asset purchase program has gone into asset-backed. And that will become relevant. The other thing is this one, which is the net purchase, how much net purchases the ECB was trying to achieve, which is that dotted blue line. I'm not going to comment on this other than to say what you saw here is 2019, basically the net asset purchases dropped to zero. This was supposed to be the beginning of a normalization of monetary policy. And of course, what we saw is the pandemic comes and it goes all the way back up. And that is without talking about the pandemic emergency program itself, which started at 750 billion and is now increased to 1.85 trillion. Again, we're talking about eye-watering numbers here. But what's interesting in terms of the securitization, remember this is about securitization, what do you need to pay attention to? Although a lot of attention has been given to the asset-backed purchase program, we do not think that it is a major macro influence on the future shape of the securitization market in Europe. It is important because, of course, it has an impact, and a meaningful impact, depending on its size, on pricing, and it will obviously bring in spreads. So if you're looking at where to put your money, if you're looking at whether or not spreads are compared to covered bonds or corporates on the right place, the ABS-PP, is important for you. But for us, it's not a major driver of the overall holistic shape of the market. What is a major driver is the TLTRO. And the TLTRO, the targeted long-term refinancing operations of the ECB, are basically the lending made by the ECB to banks at extremely low rates. The TLTRO is at minus 50 basis points with the deposit rate. The PLTRO, which is the pandemic version of this, slightly less generous, but it's still at minus 25. And the enormous amounts, you can see here again, the amounts we're talking about, these enormous amounts of cheap funding are the primary reason why no securitization can be. Why would a bank go and do a securitization, big universal bank do a securitization when it can get minus 50 basis point money? Now, what's interesting, of course, is that money is not a gift. It's a loan, and it has to be repaid. And therefore, if you look at the timeline here, what is interesting is that TLTRO3, the last version of it, has to be repaid in 2023, 2024. Now, of course, you have Peltro, which sort of replaces it to some extent. We don't know how big it's going to get, and we do not. It's not quite as long funding. It's not the 3-year funding of the TLTRO. But if you're looking at things that are going to drive the macro of the securitization market in Europe, when is this money repaid? Is it good? Are these things going to be replaced by new versions of the TLTRO? That is something that you need to pay great attention to if you want to know what the likely size of the securitization market is going to be in Europe. Bank of England, similar toolbox. Their purchase program never allowed for the purchase of securitizations, so we didn't have that impact on pricing. Their versions of TLTRO was the FLS, the TFS, and now the TFSME. The FLS is closed, the TFS closed, and that money is repayable in January and February 2022, so very soon. On the other hand, with the pandemic, TFS SME has taken over its place, and that one matures in 2025. Similar dynamic. When is this money going to have to repay? When it gets repaid, is it going to be replaced by new Bank of England money? And if it is not replaced by new Bank of England money, how are banks going to replace that funding? That is a key to understanding the size of the securitization market in the UK. And therefore, we were talking about what you need to look at in terms of big macro drivers. You need to look at what are the central banks saying about their monetary policy. What are they saying about interest rates? Because that, of course, is works in tandem with the funding operations. What we know is, Jay Powell yesterday was very hawkish, apparently, in the US. So you seem to have a gradient. The US is very hawkish, and it looks like they're going to intervene or stop their intervention, actually, or limit their intervention faster. The Bank of England was sort of hawkish in speech, but then didn't do anything at the last rate setting committee. So that was a bit of a disconnect there. The ECB has been much more dovish and has suggested that they are not likely to make any moves in any direction until at least well into 2022. But that is what you need to look at. Number one for the big picture on the securitization market.
Thanks, Ian. I think that was quite insightful, and everybody knows that cheap money is difficult to replace, but at some point it has to happen, and some people might start thinking about it a bit sooner than later. Nevertheless, monetary policy aside, I thought from our discussions, there are some other also quite important kind of mega macro trends that are affecting issues or will affect issues of securitization. So what is, in your mind, the next most important thing following monetary policy that can affect the securitization market?
Okay, so the second big macro kind of elephant in this particular herd of elephants is Basel III and the implementation of Basel III. So again, we're going to start with the European Union. 27th October of this year, the European Commission published its final Basel implementation package. So this is a series of laws. Those laws are now in front of the European Parliament and the European Council, the member states acting through the European Council, and will become law at some point, maybe, probably. So one thing that is worth saying is that this package, and particularly the output floor, which we're going to deal with, the output floors, is very controversial. And it's going to be very politically controversial. So a smooth passage of this legislation is unlikely. I think we're going to see some sparks here. But there are four elements to the package. One is the institution of the output floors, which we're going to go through. One is the regulatory oversight of climate risk in bank reporting on sustainability, which pings off reports from the EBA. That's actually potentially important also for securitization, and we're going to discuss that in a separate section. There's some provisions for bank resolutions, which may be important in and of themselves, but have no impact on securitization. And then some interesting thing about rules regarding third country branches, which, although it has not been discussed in the context of securitization, could actually have some interesting impacts on the securitization market. So let's first go very quickly through that. Certain parts of the EU have become very concerned that non-European banks are operating through branches. And of course, branches are not technically, I'm not going to go into the highly technical aspects of this, but they're not technically supervised and capitalized as separate standalone entities. And so this concern has led to this proposal, which is that any third country, i.e. non EU bank that is operating in a member state has more than 30 billion in assets in that member state is going to be investigated, examined to see whether they pose a systemic risk. And if they do, if it's concluded that they do pose potentially a systemic risk, then they will be forced either to convert into a subsidiary or to basically be regulated as if they were a subsidiary. Now, this is also very controversial, by the way, for a lot of reasons. But one of the interesting impacts on securitization, of course, is that if those American, British, Chinese banks are forced to become subsidiaries, they will be separately capitalized, and they will therefore have to start thinking about how to manage that capital at the subsidiary level in the EU, rather than simply manage the capital back in Tokyo, New York, LA, wherever the capital is ultimately consolidated. And that could actually have an impact on securitization.
And Ian, actually, to be fair, I mean, similar rules already apply in the US for any foreign banks having over a certain threshold. Then you kind of ask very kindly to become a subsidiary and actually be controlled locally.
Yes.
So that's
right.
And we're already seeing some non-EU institutions in Europe starting to set up subsidiaries in EU, although in a smaller scale, but they're starting to prepare possibly for the likelihood that they have to have capital locally. So we already seeing people preparing for that.
That's right. So I don't think this is going to be a major driver of securitization going forward, but it is one where it is worth paying attention because it will have potentially an impact. We might see some securitizations from these new, if there are any new subsidiaries of third country banks. Much more important, I think, for securitization potentially is the infamous output floor concept. So the output floor is a Basel III agreement by the BIS committee, which basically says that up until now, if you were a sophisticated bank, you were allowed to use your internal models to calculate your capital. This is for those of you who are deep into the weeds of this is the famous KIRB. IRB stands for internal rate based. Internal ratings based approach. So you're basically able to use your own model, your own data, and that would deliver you your capital requirement. There was a concern by some people in Basel that this was being abused, whatever that meant, and therefore it was decided that there should be a floor. That floor is 72.5% of what the standardized approach, which is not your internal model, but a standardized approach based on Basel's own kind of conclusions. 72.5% of the standardized approach is going to be your floor. So if you bring your internal model and your internal model shows that your capital requirement for a particular pool of assets as a bank is less than 72.5% of what the standardized approach would give as the required capital for that, then your internal model is thrown away and you are floored. It's an output floor at 72.5%. Okay, so this is, as I said, extremely controversial. Part of the way in which the European Commission has dealt with that controversy is pushing back the date at which this has to come into force. The Basel Committee expected this to come into force January 2023. The European Commission has pushed this back to January 2025. It has also created a 5-year transition period where that output floor goes from 50% of the KSA, the standardized approach capital, to 72.5 over a 5-year period. And according to the EBA and the Commission's numbers, that will only on average increase the capital requirements of banks by 9%. Now, two things. One is some people are pointing out that in a previous agreement, Basel had said it shouldn't increase capital overall. So 9% is considered to be too much by some. The other thing is that some of the many European banks are challenging those numbers and saying it is more than 9%.
Fair, and it's fair to say that depending on the business model that you have, I mean, if you are a bank that tends to originate, mortgage loans, very, low LTV mortgage loans, or let's say high quality assets, then your risk rates are extremely low, around 15-20%. So going to a 75% output will almost double your capital, your risk-weighted assets. If you're a bank that originates more risky type of business, then it shouldn't really make too much of a difference to you. And it's also interesting, if you put it together, it's almost Basel 3 or 4, depends how you call it, moves you closer to Basel 1 than any time before. So it's an interesting, I think, amendment, and it will definitely append a lot of business models of various banks across Europe, depending on whether you use risky lending or no low risky lending kind of business.
I mean, as I said, this is very controversial for a reason. Many banks have been sharpening their pencils and looking with horror at the numbers that are coming out. And actually, I have to thank Harry for mentioning Basel IV. The nomenclature of Basel is getting extremely complicated. And people will talk about Basel IV. I've heard people talk about Basel 3.5. So just so that everybody knows when they're reading in the press, Basel IV is basically this last chunk of Basel III being implemented. The people at the Basel Committee like to say it's only Basel III, it's the Basel III deal, but in common parlance, it's often referred to as Basel IV. So when I say Basel III implementation, we can also describe it as Basel IV. Now, why is this really important for securitization in the long term? Because here's this formula, Harry put it together because I don't know any maths, and it's true, by the way, I'm very, very bad at maths. I do words, I don't do numbers. But if this is the capital requirement, right, that the output floor gives you. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of people, of course, have been focusing on KIRB versus the 0.725 of KSA. But your capital requirement is that number times your risk-weighted assets. And what that means is that if output floors do come in, and they are very, very painful for banks, for certain banks, one of the ways you can soften that blow is by reducing your RWAs. You can reduce your capital requirement by either getting a low KIRB or going in for assets that have a low KSA, or you can reduce your RWAs. And of course, securitization can do that. It can allow you to have low RWAs. And therefore, output floors are potentially a very strong impetus to do securitization once they start coming in. But of course, and there'll be a slide at the end of this, that assumes that you have a workable SRT regime. For those not familiar with the acronym, SRT is significant risk transfer. This assumes that the regime, the rules around significant risk transfer, which allows you to reduce your RWAs via securitization, are reasonable and workable, because if they're not, then there is no way you can do that.
One question, Ian. I mean, that will apply to all assets, whether you securitize them or not.
Well, the output floor.
The 72% kind of.
Yes. So look, I think there are a lot of technical hair on this particular hairball. So I don't think we should get too deep into those weeds, because otherwise we could be here all night. But yes, there are lots and lots of technical issues around the output floors, how they're calculated, what they apply to, etc. And those will also have to be sorted out in due course. But if you look at the timeline of the Basel III implementation in Europe, it's the 2025 with the 5-year transition. Now, obviously, people are going to start, acting as if the output floors are in place, assuming the law passes before 2025. But the full impact will only happen in 2025. Actually, the full impact will only happen in 2030. But the real bite starts in 2025. When will the law be passed? As I said, it's very controversial, so it's hard to tell, but sometime we suspect in 2023. I'd be surprised if the law passed before that. I could be wrong, it could be faster than that. Now moving to the UK. Good question. So technically the output floors should be coming into place as they were scheduled to in January 2023, because that's what the Basel Committee had said. And they would operate in exactly the same way as they operate, because it's in the EU, because it's a general rule from Basel III. But, and this is a sentence you will see again and again and again in this presentation, it's difficult to map out the future of securitization or other regulation involving finance in the City of London, because there is a debate that has not yet been resolved. That debate is one that is being held between the Treasury and Number 10 in the context of Brexit. And it is a question about whether the UK decides at one end of the spectrum, obviously it's a spectrum, it's not a binary choice, but at one end of the spectrum, the UK decides that it's going to be Singapore on the Thames, that it's going to have a very, very low regulatory burden environment for finance, and it's going to basically be an offshore center for Europe, trying to compete on price and regulation to get as much business as possible. But of course, with the likely reaction of the European Union, which is to basically prevent the UK from playing within the European space in any way, in any shape possible. The alternative, at the other end of the spectrum, as I said, it's a spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is a decision whereby the UK decides to stay pretty much in line with the European Union, and therefore tries to convince the European Union that they should have some kind of attenuated access to the European space without the shutters coming down. Those are high politics decisions. They will be taken by Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, assuming Boris Johnson is still with us in the next few months. But until they have been taken, those macro decisions will drive the micro decisions. What do we do with securitization regulation? What do we decide? What do we do with Basel III? And therefore, everything is in a state of stasis. It's very difficult for us to know where the UK is going to go in the coming years until we have the answer to that macro question. And I think that answer has certainly not been provided publicly, and I'm not even sure that answer exists at this stage. I don't think that decision has been made. So you have to bear with us when it comes to the UK. The fog of war is deep and heavy here, and will not lift until we have an answer to that macro question of what does the United Kingdom want to do with its financial services. So the timeline for Basel III implementation in the UK should be the same as it was before in the before the Europeans decided to push out the implementation in 2025.
Cannot be absent from that, and we did a webinar recently about it, but in the context of macro points, I think we can summarize, or at least put the big picture why green potentially plays a role after taking into consideration monetary policy and, of course, Basel 3 or 4, depends how you look at it.
Yes. So basically, as we know, no presentation, no speech, no action can be taken anywhere in Europe without talking about green, which is a good thing, by the way, since we only have one planet, and it is sort of the most important thing in agenda item facing us right now. And that is true also of securitization. So green, we think here at BCS, would be an important component of securitization. Why? Going forward, because it's both a risk and an opportunity. It's an opportunity because there are very few green investable assets in existence in any asset class. I'm not talking about securitization. And there's a huge demand, right? The Morningstar reported that in the first quarter of 2021, 120 billion euros have been raised in one quarter for sustainable funds. And this is the same globally. I think last year there were over 700 new green funds created across the globe. So there's a huge demand. And so if you can satisfy that demand, then you have a great opportunity to print paper at a very cheap rate. So there's this great opportunity here because there's not a huge amount of competition in the green space if securitization is able to play. It's also a threat because we don't, first of all, for the moment, all the green stuff is not mandatory, it's optional, but at some point we are pretty sure that public bodies in Europe, be it the European Parliament, be it various governments, be it the ECB, will actually either make things mandatory or will put in place regulations and rules that will really make it difficult or make it very costly to do a non-green deal. So if you can't fit into green, if we can't end up with a regime where securitization fits and finds its niche within the green ecology, then it's going to be potentially very hard for securitization to ever grow to, we were talking about this 500 billion, 600 billion market. It's going to be very difficult to do that if you can't provide a green offering within that suite of products. So risk and opportunity in green. We did a presentation there. You can see it at the bottom of that slide. You can download the slides. You download the slides, I'm told if you click there, you'll be taken to our presentation. We did a green securitization webinar, a lot of detail, a lot of information. I'm not going to go through that again, obviously, we don't have the time. But basically, please go and download our webinar if you want more detail. But basically, the risk for us as we see it as PCS is a number of things. First is a big debate about whether green securitization is the securitization of green assets. So only green assets, green mortgages, loans to buy, electric cars will be green, which would be a huge problem because there are very few green assets. The whole green plan of the Europe is to create a transition to a sustainable economy. If we already had a sustainable economy, you'd have a lot of green assets. But if you're starting a transition, it's because you don't have a lot of green assets. So if a green securitization is only a securitization of green assets, that's going to really, really shrink the potential universe of green securitization. Versus the proceeds approach, which is you do a securitization, you raise proceeds, and you take those proceeds and spend them on a green activity, which is the rule for every other capital market instrument. That debate is still going on, although the green proceeds seems to be gaining traction amongst policymakers. But that has to land in the right place for securitization to play a role in green. The other concern is that we will end up with bespoke and idiosyncratically onerous disclosure requirements. Securitization has suffered for a very long time from the fact that it has rules just for it, and that those rules are extremely heavy. And so another risk for securitization is that the rules come out and you can have a green corporate bond, a green covered bond, if you publish a 4-page description of what you're doing, and you can only have a green securitization if you fill in a 75-page, 400,000 cell data sheet, which has to be filed with a repository. And if you have one cell missing, then you can't do green. That is a concern. Idiosyncratic and heavy rules. And even more of a risk is that you have on the due diligence investor side, a completely different definition, completely different regime for green securitization, which means that funds investing in green will say, I can invest in covered bonds, I can invest in corporates, I have a system set up, but if I want to invest in green securitization, I will need a totally different system, different analysis, different tools, different IT. I can't be bothered. I'm just going to focus on the other asset classes. So those are the three risks: asset versus proceeds, bespoke and onerous disclosure requirements, or even worse, an entirely bespoke regime for green that only applies to securitization. So where are we in that debate? Well, the European Commission issued its green bond standard legislation in draft form in July. It's being discussed by the Council and Parliament as we speak. How fast this is going to happen, hard to say. But of course, once the European Green Bond Standard, which is not a securitization law, it's a law for all capital market instruments, which defines European Union Green Standard. Once that is out, of course, there will then be the technical standards. So it will take time. This is a slide. I'm not going to go through this slide. Just read it at your leisure, which defines what a green bond is. Again, not just securitization. So that's the general issue. And then you have two specific securitization green points that are being dealt with. The EBA is supposed to come up with two reports. One is on disclosure for RMBS and auto deals in the sustainability place, which is this one, 26D6. That was supposed to come out, by the way, July. Hasn't come out. And then the development of a sustainable securitization framework. And I was telling you the concern that we had at PCS about a bespoke, completely different framework for green. Well, there it is, Article 45A of the amendment to the securitization regulation asks the EBA to come up with a definition of a bespoke standard. It's supposed to come up with that by November the 1st, i.e. last month. We haven't seen it. Whispers in the corridor suggest that this may come out in the first quarter of next year. But what really concerns us here at PCS is how does this fit with the European Union Green Bond Standard? How does it fit with other capital market instruments? And the answer is it doesn't. The timetable for this green bond definition, of green securitization definition that is supposed to come out of the EBA does not mesh in any way, shape, or form with the discussions that are taking place today under the Slovene presidency on the European Union Green Bond Standard. These things don't seem to have been thought through sequentially, and there is therefore this risk of a car crash where securitization ends up with its own regime, not because people think it needs a different regime, but simply because people haven't really thought through the sequencing of how you come up with laws on green. So this is definitely a concern for us. And of course, once the EBA does come out, this November paper that is now being pushed forward to the early part of 2022, when that paper does come out, it also has to be discussed and approved or not by the European Commission. So there's still a lot of hurdles here, a lot of things happening that could very substantially, either make the risk for securitization around green come about, or make the opportunity come about. And this is a space we need to look at very carefully. We at PCS are actively engaged in discussions with various policymakers about this, and I know that obviously other people are doing the same. This is really a space we need to look at. So this is the timeline. As you can see, European Union Green Bond Standard probably sometime in 2023, I would reckon, for the technical standards which are going to be essential to running it. The law itself probably passing sometime in 2022. UK is somewhat behind, not far behind, but is somewhat behind. They don't have a taxonomy as the European Union does. They are saying they will have one by the end of 2022. No decision seems to be made as to whether we will have a UK green bond standard or not, some legislation or not. And SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Directive, has not yet, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is not in place yet in the UK, although it probably will be sometime in 2022. But basically that sentence, again, the UK government has yet to make key post-Brexit strategic decisions on macro principle of financial regulation, so macro decisions on status. This is basically the same thing. What are we going to do in green securitization in response to what's happening in the European Union? We don't know yet, because we have to decide, do we in the UK want to be Singapore on the Thames, or does the UK want to be, meshed within the European Union, or something in between? So that's sort of green. I mean, the green timeline in the UK is just at this stage guesswork. We don't know where this particular train is going. So that's green. Green is going to be very important, as I said. If we, in securitization, can find a comfortable niche within the green financial ecosystem, there is great opportunity for securitization. If we cannot, if we end up being pushed in a corner with an unworkable regime, then that great ambitions for 400, 500 billion market is going to really struggle. So again, after monetary policy and Basel III implementation, particularly the output floors, green is another subject that we need to pay attention to in the years that come.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. But there is a lot of regulation coming in securitization, and review is coming up in the EU. Shouldn't that play a role? As well. Isn't that important? A lot of technical standards, RTS is waiting, all the other stuff is in the corner. Is that something we should look at and be concerned about?
Well, on principle, you should always be concerned about regulation. Regulations cannot create markets, but they can certainly destroy them. The answer is yes and no. So most of these presentations, will focus on changes specific to securitization in order to plot, where securitization is going to go. So as you've noticed, as Harry's pointed out, we've got through three sections yet: monetary policy, Basel III implementation in green, and we haven't talked about, or slightly a bit in green, but otherwise we haven't talked about changes to the securitization regulations themselves. So this is the yes and the no. Let's start with the securitization review. So we all saw back in May 2021 the report of the Joint Committee of the ESAs on the functioning of the European securitization regime. We were very openly describing it as a missed opportunity. You can go to our website and our news section, you'll see our report on that. Following that joint committee, there was a consultation that closed in September that was published by the European Union, the European Commission, which asked lots of comments. PCS, as many others, filed their response. It was 41 pages long. It was a very long consultation. But we have to remember that this review was mandated by law. It's not something the European Commission said, we think we have an issue to deal with. The law requires us to have a review, so we're going to have a review. You'll see in that little gold box, I say securitization review X calibrations, and we'll get to calibrations later because that is actually quite important. For the moment, as far as we can tell, based on the Joint Committee report and the kind of questions being asked by the European Commission, there doesn't seem to be in the securitization review an awful lot of game changers, or for that matter, any game changers at all. So there is some discussion of a relief on disclosure for private securitization that's important, right? And as I said, there's lots of things that are important for various groups, various asset classes, various countries. So these things do matter. I'm not saying they don't matter, but if you're looking to the distant horizon as to where securitization is going to go, there doesn't look like at this stage in the securitization review for the European Union, there's an awful lot there that is going to really change the outlook. UK, I don't know if I drew your attention to this sentence. The UK government has yet to make a key post-Brexit strategic decision, and so on and so forth. Well, once more with feeling, same thing. It's very difficult to understand, to perceive whether the UK government, UK Treasury had a consultation just like the EU. It closed early September, just like the EU. But it's very difficult to determine whether this was done because the law required it. And as law-abiding nations do, they basically said, well, we have to have a review, we'll have a review. Or whether this was done in the spirit of really trying to see if something could be changed about the regulation. We don't really know. And so it's very difficult to tell whether anything will come out of the securitization review that is happening in the UK. And of course, the answer to that goes back to this sentence. Whether anything will come out of this will depend on whether ultimately the UK decides to radically break with the European Union on regulation and decides to completely remold various bits of its regulation, and securitization is just one small part of that enormous puzzle, or whether the UK decides ultimately to be pretty much in line with the EU, in which case this review might suggest a few technical amendments on disclosure and so on, that will help, but will not really move the dial. We just don't know. Again, this fog of war I was speaking about before, when it came to Basel, when it came to green, is still hanging over the field here in the UK. We just don't really know what's going to happen. So I said specific securitization regulation changes and reviews, calibrations. So now we get to the bit of securitization regulation that does matter, which are what we call the calibration issues. Ever since the securitization regulation was voted, which people need to remember, it's December 2017, so we're talking about a while now. These are the three key issues that were raised by market participants. I'm not going to go through them in detail because that will take a long time. If you want to read about the technical detail of that, you can go again. There's a little at the bottom of that slide. If you get the slide downloaded, which you can, you click there. This will take you to the article that we published, BCS published in Eurofee's regulatory magazine. Eurofee is a think tank based in Paris. Excellent people, and we published an article there called "The Indispensable Reform," and it does go through the calibration issues in greater detail. So if you don't know what the calibration issues, then you want to know more than you ever wished, then you can go there to read it. But the three calibration issues are this: CRR calibrations. The calibrations in the CRR for bank investors and STS securitization are grossly exaggerated for the risk that the banks take. This is, of course, a very tangential statement, but we think we and many other market participants and other groups that speak for securitization, I think, can demonstrate that fairly well. So you need to reduce the capital requirement for bank investing in securitization. Solvency 2 is CRR for insurance companies. So again, we can, I think, demonstrate that the requirements of capital allocation for insurance companies buying STS securitizations are grossly exaggerated. And eligibility criteria, you can put certain types of securitization, STS securitization, in the liquidity coverage ratio pools for banks. That's a very attractive feature of any capital market instrument. But the eligibility criteria for securitizations, we think, are extremely constraining and far too conservative. And not just us, but pretty much everybody who's looking at this side of the picture. And there's a lot of data to show that. The European Commission appointed a what the Americans would call a blue ribbon independent committee to look at this, not just at this, but to look at all capital markets. It was a committee tasked with looking at the Capital Markets Union as a whole, so they looked at all capital markets regulation. But when it came to securitization, this independent committee set up by the Commission in June 2020 concluded exactly as everybody else had, including PCS, that these numbers were too high, the eligibility criteria were too tight. And everybody concluded that solving these things and getting the right numbers and the right eligibility criteria would be a great step forward for the securitization market. So June 2020, the report of the independent committee gets published, and we're now starting to see some movement. I mentioned before the joint committee of the ESA's report on the functioning of the securitization market, where we said that it had been a missed opportunity. Primary reason we said it was a missed opportunity is they basically sidestepped the whole issue of calibration, which we thought was the key reform that was required. So the good news is the Commission has now officially indicated that the calibration issues are up for review. In mid-October of this year, the Commission published a call for evidence to the Joint Committee of the ESA. So they basically turned to the EBA, ESMA, and EIOPA and said, please give us your views on the calibration issues. That's great. The bad news is the ESA is not required to do this before September 2022. So they're given it pretty much 1 year. And I have to say, to my horror, I was talking to a person who is on one of the committees of one of the ESAs, and his thought to me was, well, I hope we can make that deadline, which is what it is. But hopefully by September 2022, we will have the ESA's views. Of course, that means that it has to be taken up by the Commission. The Commission will then probably launch a consultation, and therefore any proposals are starting now, well, definitely going to be in 2023. And then you are in this danger area. For those who've worked in Brussels or with Brussels for many years will know 2024 is the last year of the Commission, of this particular Commission. And it is traditional that commissions do very little of moment during their last year on this principle that they don't want to bind the next commission. So we are now getting close. It's like this whirlpool, you know, where the ships start to sink. We're getting close to the whirlpool on the calibration issues. If we're starting to talk into 2023, it starts to stay. 2024, it's going to be hard. But so the good news is, yes, this is now on the agenda and people acknowledge that this has to be done. The bad news is, can we do it fast enough, or are we then going to go to the next commission and then we're talking 2025 and God knows when? So that's sort of where we are as the timeline shows here. Legislative action 2023, 2024. Let's hope. What about the calibration issues in the UK? Well, once more with feeling, the UK government has yet to make key post-Brexit strategic decisions on macro principles of financial regulation. So micro decisions are in stasis. One of the micro decisions that is in status is, are we going to revise CRR? No longer CRR. Are we going to revise Solvency II? No longer Solvency II. Are we going to revise the eligibility criteria for liquidity coverage ratios? We have heard nothing. In fact, one of the items that still hasn't really moved forward, either positively or negatively, is whether the UK creates a synthetic STS regime, which is in place in the European Union. We're not hearing an awful lot about this. So again, we're waiting for the macro decisions to be made. So the timeline, well, as you can see, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, that was quite insightful. And if I can summarize what you said, I mean, number one, that would affect the market is what the ECB will do going forward, now that TLTRO and not, and if we see that they are reducing or being less generous on that program, that should help issuance. Basel floors, the fact that they've been pushed by 2 years means any meaningful or sizable SRT market is probably going to start a bit later, but in the next 1 or 2 years, we start seeing banks, at least because it takes about a year to prepare, the underlying, let's say, mechanics, reportings, IT issues. We should start banks getting prepared next year to start issuing 2013, 2023, 2024. Where they're going to start dealing with that. Calibration issues are, postponed also for the year after that, but those will affect decisions what banks will do in the EU. If we look at the UK, I don't want to repeat myself, but the UK looks like, nothing will happen, or at least we don't know when something will happen. So that's one of the major points in the UK. So what else is left to do? I mean, the important thing is we have not to miss the point that, technical standards, the thing we discussed, what is not the micro view, but the micro view or the micro elements, but those can be very, very, let's say, important as well. Sometimes unfortunate choice of rules or, rules being voted from different departments who are working in silos, while on their own they look okay. Once you combine them, they seem to create issues, and that I think is something we should pay attention at least in the next 1 to 2 years before the bigger macro events come into place. So if I go back to the beginning, and my question is to you, securitization, Quo Vadis, how would you summarize that? Where are we going as a market?
Yeah. So thank you, Harry, for that point. Of course, that we've been talking about the huge pictures, a great, what historians call la longue durée, although they talk about centuries rather than years. But don't lose sight. The details matter. The devil is really in the details, but so are the angels sometimes. So the technical stuff is important. So Quo Vadis. Well, I think there are two things that I would like to take out of this presentation. First of all, we've added all our timelines together. It's kind of very attractive, I think. But what you see on the timelines, the likely ETA, those little red circles, where things really start to bite, you're going to see it's 2023, maybe 2023. Of course, this is crystal ball gazing, right? So it may turn out that all of this is wrong. We were looking at a number of things happening in the next few months. All of a sudden, Omicron turns up, the fifth wave turns up, Omicron turns up, and everything goes back to square one. So crystal ball gazing is a notoriously dangerous thing, and I'm sure that somebody will bring this slide up in 5 years' time and go, Ian, you said this, what the hell? You were completely wrong. And so let's take this with a pinch of salt. But nevertheless, if you look at currently best predictions of when things are going to happen, you're going to see, TLTRO in Europe not before 2023, or you're going to see, a constriction when TLTRO 3 is being repaid, and maybe there won't be a TLTRO 4. Basel 3 is now 2025, so it's going to start biting 2024, maybe late 2023 for banks that are looking a little bit further in the future. Green securitization's 2023 story. It's not until then that we're going to see the European Green Bond Standard and the technical standards around them that will really start defining this. Securitization review, there's no ETA because there's really nothing there, I think. Again, it could be wrong. And then the calibration issues, again, we're talking about 2023, maybe even well into 2023. So what comes out of this is don't expect major transformations soon, right? We're looking at 2023 stories here. Of course, between now and then, there will be discussions, there will be votes, there will be amendments, there will be technical standards, there will be an awful lot happening. What happens in 2023 is going to be structured, designed, and shaped between now and then. But the big macro changes are 2023 stories and beyond. So patience is one of the things that I would kind of advise. Don't turn around in the second quarter of 2022 and go, well, nothing much has happened yet. It's not supposed to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm hoping that we've conveyed, these macro issues. A lot of us spend an awful lot of time on the very micro stuff because as we saw in that slide, by the way, three slides back, it matters, right? The technical standards matter. The details really do matter, but you should not lose sight also of the big movements that will start shaping our market, as well as pretty much all the other capital markets, by the way. And I haven't even talked about things like the rise of China or Xi Jinping's new policies, which can ripple through to the European markets and so on and so forth. So this could be a book, but nevertheless, those four, because as I said, the securitization review we don't think is really going to be meaningful, but keep an eye on it. You never know. So those 4, maybe 5 big topics, I think, are the ones you need to keep an eye on if you want to see where the big picture is going to go.
And Ian, it's fair to say, I mean, if the outcome of those changes is in the right direction, that could have a meaningful impact on the market. I mean, if we want to see a securitization market going to 200, 300, and at some point 400 billion of annual issuance, we need to get all those 5 right. I mean, if any of those rules is implemented in a different way, it will definitely impact the size of the market, right? So we need to get all of them right for the market to actually start having a meaningful, role and not be a niche market.
Yes, and hence again that slide, the details matter. I mean, the macro is built in part from lots of micro decisions. I mean, not only, but there are some macro decisions that get done, but there are also some micro decisions which together create the macro trend. So yes, absolutely. Let's be sure that some of those micro decisions do not undermine the big macro progress.
Mindful of the time, Ian, I think we can open up for Q&A.
Absolutely.
Anybody who wants to download the notes, they can go to the handout session and they can download the notes and the slides from this presentation. You're all going to receive also a replay, so you can forward it and review this. And also would appreciate if you could answer those 5 little questionnaire. It should take you less than 30 seconds. So we are open for questions. So please send us your questions through the chat and we will answer them. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.
If anybody is shy about asking a question on this chat, you can find Harry, you can find me. Feel free to ask the questions offline.
One question is securitization in the US. And we have a question about SDS label. Can UK issuers go from mainland going to maintain the label? That's one of the questions we heard.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so securitization in the US is a huge issue. Securitization in the US works in a very different way in some ways. Well, I mean, some obviously similarities, but securitization in the US is really bifurcated between the agency and the non-agency part. The non-agency part, because of the accounting rules, is not deconsolidating. So the non-agency, non-Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, Freddie Mac securitizations are not used for RWA capital management. The other thing, of course, in the US is you have very large non-bank lenders where securitization is really their business model. They're not deposit takers, and therefore the dynamics of US securitization is very different. In terms of RWA, you have Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but I think the outstandings are now $7 trillion. Effectively, the United States has nationalized its mortgage market, which is a bit odd in the land of free enterprise. They have had a Soviet approach to nationalizing their mortgage market. And that's how banks are able to get stuff off their balance sheet, because mortgages are, of course, the number one asset for most banks. So they can manage their capital through the agencies by selling their mortgages, and they do so in gigantic amount. And then you have the often non-bank, but certainly non-agency part of securitization, which does not deconsolidate, but on the other hand is very, very deep, very, very liquid, and provides cheap funding. So the dynamics are very, very different in the US.
And it's fair to say, Ian, that in the US, on one hand, they have socialized the mortgage market, but on the other hand, those big 2 agencies are sharing that risk through massive SRT transactions. They do massive first loss pieces they sell. So in a way, they have managed to take the entire market and then just share that risk again back to the right people in the capital market. And the best or the closest replica to that is the synthetic SRT market in Europe. That's the closest replica.
Yes.
To that.
That's right.
Of course, different size, different dynamic, but that's the close.
And of course, guarantee. There is this, there is a government guarantee behind Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that can never be ignored. So regarding the STS label, do you think the UK issuers are going to maintain this label? I'm not sure what exactly the question is, because it can mean two things. It can be either the label exists and the issuers will use it. The answer, I think, is as long as the label exists, I think they will use it, for the simple reason that it's a relatively easy standard to meet in the traditional asset classes. They already do so they don't have to change anything. At this stage, the cost, if you want, was in transforming or modifying their systems to meet the STS standards. Once that's done, and they've pretty much all done it in the mortgage and auto space, you might as well keep doing it. I mean, there's no downside to doing it pretty much once you're set up. So I think they will. Will the government keep it? I think they will, because again, why not?
And I'm guessing, Ian, if somebody has issued with an STS label and then he removes it, the least you can raise is suspicions. Why you do that? Are you trying to hide something? Is this something that doesn't meet? I mean, you raise more questions than answers by doing that.
Yeah.
You could.
Yeah, exactly.
We have one question: no capital relief for EU investors in UK transactions. Is that I think the question? But I think UK.
Yes, that's correct. So if you have a UK STS, EU investors have no capital benefit of any kind from that. It does not cross over. It does cross over the other way for a couple of years. There's a kind of transition period, but it does not cross over. No, UK STS is not recognized by the EU legislation.
I think we have two more. Any last question?
Okay. Thank you
for joining. Looking forward to talk to you offline. For anybody who wants to ask any more questions, as I said, please answer the questionnaire, and the handouts are going to be available for another 2 minutes from the handout section. And looking forward to see you to the next PCS Insight webinar at some point in 2022. And thank you all for the kind words in the chat. I think we can conclude.
Thank you very much. And please join us for our future webinars. We will have many more to come. Oh, and sign up for our newsletter, where we have, I think, quite interesting stuff to say.
Thank you, guys. Bye.